Okay, right on. Yeah, let's give this a quick sync. Sweet. Welcome to the Monkey Dance Podcast. My name is Ohan.
My name is Guilherme.
And we're sitting here with Bojin. Hey, man.
Hey.
So, yeah, we'll just kick it off to you. Bojin Zhu, who are you and what do you do?
So I'm a philosopher. I am a doctoral researcher at University of Vienna. And then, I do philosophy, basically. So I have a very wide interest. I do lots of kind of different kinds of philosophy. But I guess my current focus of PhD research, and what I guess we're going to talk about today, is the topic of conceptual engineering or conceptual ethics. It's known by, or conceptual negotiation, really. It's known by many different names. But essentially, the idea is, we use all sorts of different concepts and we can probably assess and improve them. That's kind of the very basic idea. Yeah.
So why don't you start us off with telling us what a concept is in philosophy in general?
Yeah, so I mean, it's controversial, right? As in philosophy, like basically anything is controversial. So there are different ways of like thinking about it, right? So one way of thinking about it is to say concepts very basically are the elements of thought, right? So you have the concept of a table. You can tell that there is a table if there is one, and you can say, if there's no table in this room, you can say there is no table. That's kind of like a concept. And then you can use that concept repetitively in many different kinds of thought, right? You can say a cup of coffee is sitting on the table, or we are sitting around the table, or you can formulate as many thoughts as you want surrounding a concept. So very basically, that's how you can think of concepts, as basically elements of thought. But then I guess in philosophy, the issue is like people give very different accounts of concepts. They say concepts are very, very different things. So I'm kind of not really that much interested in taking a stand about what concepts are exactly. And also that's, I think personally, again, people will disagree, but I think that's a kind of a sort of meta semantics, so to speak, a kind of mature account of concepts isn't really necessary for talking about conceptual assessment and improvement very much, because we would still be doing these kind of things. We have been doing and we will do these kind of things really despite what concepts are. And for me, I would say like there isn't really one thing that concepts are, just metaphysically they're like tables. There is one thing that tables are, but not necessarily concepts, right? So concepts, there are different ways of conceptualizing concepts, as it were, and then different ways of conceptualizing it might bring about different benefits. So I'm kind of, again, I'm not really taking that much of a stand. It's kind of a topic on its own, but it's more theoretical and then gets into the very deep waters of philosophy. Yeah.
Right. So, yeah, you take concepts as an object then of your interest, but concepts purely as a catch-all for semantic categorization. It's
yes,
like an epistemic pursuit.
Yes, basically. Yeah, exactly.
Right.
So as an object of my pursuit, but not exactly as an object, as a metaphysical entity. The object is more like the subject object. It's, what I'm aiming at, but not necessarily it's a thing, it's an entity, right? That kind of carries us a bit more into the ontological realm. I mean, the word object is always kind of ambiguous, right? Which kind of gets us into problems lots of the times, I guess.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, very good.
So,
are you acquainted to what cognitive scientists call representations?
Sort of, I guess. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. No. If you were, I will ask you.
Yeah.
What's the difference? So, if your concept is an element of thought?
Yeah.
That would basically describe what we try to say that representations are.
Yeah.
So, would be the same thing, for what you know, maybe.
Yeah. No. Yeah. I mean, I kind of agree that people say concepts are representational devices, right? And especially like lots of the times, I think in philosophy, in lots of the philosophical text, you see people saying, well, concepts are very controversial. Nobody knows what concepts really are. So let's talk about representational devices instead, right? Let's talk about assessing and improving representational devices instead. So that's kind of, I guess, a way. Yeah, that's also a way to go. But then some people kind of disagree. Some people may not think that all concepts are representational devices. Some people may think that some are. And again, it kind of runs into the issue of what representational means. So I guess I'm not really that familiar with cognitive science, right? But my kind of guess is that when you talk about representational devices, it's a bit more, how to put it, metaphysically lightweight. So it doesn't really carry a very substantial sort of thing. I guess, again, because I guess I'm not really that familiar with cognitive science in general, but I guess in philosophy, like the word representational carries a lot of historical connotations of how people have used it, and some people used it in a very sort of metaphysically heavyweight sort of way. There is a very substantial, robust, some sort of representational relationship between thoughts and things. And then, I mean, that's kind of a bit more controversial. But then in a thinner sense, so like in a sense, of course, like my concept of table, they represent tables. I mean, in that kind of slightly thinner and deflationary sense, I have no problem with talking about concepts as representational devices. Yeah.
And then the concepts would basically be categories of representations, like something that we can agree on descriptively as categories of representations. So we have, even in cognitive science, something that not a lot of cognitive scientists wade into the waters of is the philosophy of it, the metaphysics. So not too many cognitive scientists think very often about what the stimuli about that is the subject of the representation is. Is it a metaphysical entity? Am I looking at a chair? Does a chair exist? And is that what's creating the representation? So this isn't discussed too much in cognitive science, partially because it's not actually that relevant, because people are interested in what the cognition is actually doing, rather than what exists outside of the space of cognition. But of course, when we move into the philosophical realm, it becomes one of the most important things. But of course, we can sidestep the metaphysics entirely and just look at what concepts are as epistemic devices that we all share.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, it's very interesting. It might be a bit digressive, but like when phenomenologists, when people like Husserl, they try to talk about the difference between phenomenology and psychology, what he said was that, phenomenology studies pure psychology, right? It brackets all the external things, external world or whatever. And then it studies pure psychology, while the experimental psychology, at least at his time, he claims to be studying the sort of more whatever embodied. It involves a bit more physical assumptions about what the world is like. That's kind of a philosopher's attack on psychology, as it were. And then many psychologists actually push back, right? They said stuff that you said. It's like, well, I mean, external world and all the metaphysics related to it aren't really relevant to us, right? So you're kind of giving this false strawman-like attack of psychology. But anyway, that kind of gets us into something else.
Yeah, rightfully so. I think those distinctions end up being really important, just because then we understand exactly what the subject of our study is. But to me, it is also one of the flaws of how a lot of cognitive scientists do the work, is that they ignore a lot of the philosophy behind the concepts they're using. And so then they end up potentially even down avenues that aren't that theoretically important, or just don't really give us anything other than sort of statistical regularities. And I think that ends up being one of the bigger problems.
Yeah, and then I guess the thing is the opposite could happen as well, right? So the opposite is that the philosophers, especially I think given this kind of relatively close relation between philosophy and psychology or cognitive science, philosophers want to say something about psychology and cognitive science. And then I think historically there has been this debate, and not that historical, but like back in the 70s and 80s and whatever. And there are some philosophers who accuse psychologists of having a wrong account of concepts, whatever that is. And then there are other like more scientifically minded or philosopher of cognitive science. They try to push back. They're like, but you are not really looking at how psychologists or cognitive scientists are using their concept of concept, right? So you're kind of just imposing your desiderata, your criterion onto them, but they're actually not talking about the same thing that you are talking about. It's more kind of psychologistic, as it were, bodies of information that we can easily retrieve and use in whatever higher cognitive processes. But that's kind of, in philosophy, it's used slightly differently. I guess especially kind of that's why the whole thing about what concepts are really is a very vexed issue. And then, it's the vast literature on that sort of thing.
Bojin, what's the most important question that you would like to answer, or the most important problem that you would like to solve? Realistically, during your PhD.
During my PhD, I mean, I wouldn't say there is like one problem I'm aiming to solve. Again, I'm saying kind of have this almost ADHD style of doing philosophy, so I'm kind of working on various kinds of things. But a range of related issues in conceptual assessment kind of do concern me. So what is the nature of changing concepts, improving concepts? When should we improve concepts? What are the concerns that enter into our assessing and improving concepts, right? How exactly do we assess and improve our concepts? What are the criteria relevant? And I want to do some case studies of how people have done it. And I want to kind of extend that almost as a paradigm to broader philosophy. as it were. Yeah. So it's kind of like it's a range of questions centering around the topic of conceptual assessment, negotiation, improvement, etc. Yeah.
So your work is something like a meta look at conceptual engineering.
Basically, yeah, a meta look, but also like a more concrete look in a way, because I kind of try to find more examples, both in philosophy and probably outside of philosophy, that this kind of paradigm of thinking could apply to.
So you're trying to help define what conceptual engineering is by looking at different case studies of conceptual engineering.
Yes, exactly.
Right.
And then my complaint of the philosophy of conceptual engineering at this time is mostly that the examples are not very broad. So they kind of only focus on a very limited range of examples that are discussed over and over again. So I kind of want to do something different. I want to say, so many people kind of gesture towards the idea that actually we can do more than that, right? We can do more conceptual engineering, both in and outside of philosophy, but then nobody really kind of gives very concrete examples. I can't say nobody, but kind of the main focus isn't on that. And the main focus is on the kind of a very theoretical discussion of what concepts really are, and even is conceptual engineering really possible? I mean, I don't find that sort of discussion terribly fruitful. So what I want to do is to kind of drop that a little bit and look at the more concrete cases of all the conceptual negotiating happening in life. The more concrete examples we probably are going to talk about soon. But the idea is, to look at them and then to see what, it's bidirectional, right? So what the paradigm of conceptual engineering would bring to these kind of topics. And on the other hand, these topics, these kind of more concrete case studies, what would they tell us about conceptual engineering, as it were? Yeah.
And are the case studies that you're focusing on, maybe it's a bit of both, but are they targeted intentional cases of conceptual engineering, or are they more passive, like temporal cases?
Intentional. So I think intentional cases are what we are concerned with. I mean, it doesn't have to go by the name of conceptual engineering,
right?
But it's not like so obviously like the meaning of words and concepts, they change over time a lot, right? And this is by itself an interesting topic, and I'm actually very, very interested in the sort of conceptual genealogy, the changing of concepts through history. And again, it's kind of also related that this conceptual genealogy thing, how does that relate to conceptual engineering? Like how the concept has changed throughout history could be relevant to how we are going to change it, right? What can we find out through a history, through a genealogy of the concept? But no, when I'm talking about conceptual engineering, I guess I'm more focusing on the more intentional cases. It doesn't have to be philosophical, it doesn't have to be explicit, but it has to be something where you in some way recognize the defect of the previous concepts. Again, defects can be understood very broadly, and then you want to change it for the better, right? So
can conceptual engineering be non-intentional? If it's engineering?
It's terminological. I think, as I use it, I don't think it can. Again, like intentional, it doesn't mean like explicit, right? It doesn't mean you have to know the concept of conceptual engineering, but intentional just means, you have to want to, it's some people or groups of people or whatever, they want to kind of actively change the concept.
If the concepts change by some other kind of process, which does not involve active agents on the process, it's not called
conceptual engineering. I think that's kind of how it's being used in a way. Yeah. I mean, again, but kind of intentionality presents a problem, right? So what kind of intentionality? Again, the social factors come in, and then lots of the times, obviously you can say that all the conceptual changes happen because of some sort of background, social, historical, economical, whatever, these kind of very broad, that kind of go under these very broad banners. But so I don't want the topic to be that broad. It kind of loses focus a little bit.
Yeah, I found it interesting, because that's what I would assume as well, that there will be many variables on play when concepts are changing, and it's hard to disentangle the environmental factors, the social factors that are maybe pushing or stretching things here and there.
Exactly. So it's kind of hard to distinguish, but then lots of the times, I guess it's kind of, I like the parallel with talking about political changes, right? In the sense that it's not completely under your control, so you can't just say, well, this is a desirable political feature and let's just bring it about. You can't really bring it about by just willing it, right? You have to do things, and when you have to do things, you're subject to all the vicissitudes of the world, so to speak. But I guess for conceptual engineering, this focus is on the case where it's more kind of active. So it would be contrasted with the case where, concepts just kind of change historically. There are like cases where, interesting cases, I think, where, for example, the historian Quentin Skinner talk about cases that I forgot the details, but kind of during the time of Industrial Revolution, lots of the sort of the evaluative concepts that we have changed their meaning, right? I kind of vaguely remember there is this example of talking about concepts like prudence. It kind of used to be a bad word in a sense. You're kind of, it's a derogatory term almost, because you're only minding your interest. You're kind of self-interested. You're selfish in a way. But then kind of during the Industrial Revolution, the rise of capitalism, all that sort of factors, it kind of changes its meaning gradually, right? People are using it with a slightly more positive tone, or at least neutral tone in a way. So that's kind of the case where nobody really kind of intentionally wants to bring it about, but because of various social factors, it just happened, right? So yeah, I guess this is the kind of case that I'm kind of contrasting with. It's the more active, more intentional.
Can you give us then the case studies that or one that would be a good contrast to this one?
Of course.
Yeah. So and maybe just like a general look. So we have cases of just naturally occurring changing the use of concepts, which is the naturally evolving facet of language. So language naturally evolves. By this case, the way people use concepts changes because the concepts, the meaning of the words change over time. And then you have cases where concepts might be changed for a benefit other than the concept itself. So this is like maybe a political leader trying to change the definition of a particular concept.
Yeah, exactly.
Me changing the concept if I'm a political leader is not really my goal. My goal is to maybe win an election. The concept is just collateral damage.
Yeah.
And then I have this further case, which is the explicit conceptual engineering case, which is when we target cases in philosophy, in science, whatever, where I'm saying there's this concept, our interpretation of this concept is incorrect. I'm trying to redefine it for all of us. With the intention of just improving the concept.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Sometimes it's not like the intention of improving the concept for all of us. Maybe sometimes conceptual engineering can be pretty local. It can be just like, I want to improve the concept for some particular purposes. That could also very well be the case. But that's that. Yeah.
So if you want to, move into a couple of case studies.
Yeah, I mean, so broadly speaking, I think there are, what I think about, there are kind of broadly speaking 3 cases of these kind of improvements, right? So one is in science, and in science you see that very, very, very often, right? So especially if you investigate a history of science, it's kind of like scientists obviously they have been doing it, right? If you think of concepts as tools, almost human beings use the concepts to think. The idea is, well, we have to sharpen our tools, right? Lots of our everyday concepts are not sharp enough for scientific purposes, so you have to sharpen it up, right? So that's kind of involving the history of science. If you do the study, you see, for example, one case I really like is on temperature. So how you've sharpened up the concept of temperature used to be very vague, right? Without a thermometer, without a really scientific notion of temperature, you're just like, well, this feels a bit warmer, this feels a bit colder, and then that's that, right? That's a very, very vague notion of temperature. And then you kind of sharpen it up, right? To what extent? Yeah, so it's kind of like you introduce more measurement into it, and you introduce more and more precision into it, and you kind of operationalize in a way. So there is this great historical study in a book by my old supervisor called Ha-Seok Chang. The book was called Inventing Temperature. So it's kind of just a historical study of that kind. So how scientists, through their repeated experiments and operationalization, how they've sharpened the concept of temperature so that it became what it is now today. Or like notions like acidity, right? We have the notion of something being acid very, very early, something tastes sour, right? Or something that comes up in a certain result in the litmus test. And then you kind of gradually sharpen it up, right? And then now the notion of acid becomes very, very different from what it was before. So that's kind of one case of study in science. And then you have the more ethical, political cases, right? The most obvious examples that people always talk about in the literature being something like marriage or family, right? So previously we think of marriage as very heteronormative, so only a man and a woman can enter into a marriage. Now we don't think that is the case anymore, right? And we provide, and this is kind of a change of the concept of marriage, as it were, and also family as well. So it's all related, right? Previously, you think it's heterosexual and bionormative, but now you can accommodate more varied forms of families. So it's kind of we say that's an ethical improvement achieved in and through an improvement of the concept itself, right? So it's kind of like it's not one directional. It's not that the ethical improvement already happened and then it's only reflected in the concept. Nor is it that we just somehow just change the concept and then that it just changes the whole ethical landscape. But lots of times the two things happens in tandem, and then one can kind of influence and facilitate the other, right? So the social changes kind of make us change our concepts, and our concepts changes how we think, and that kind of in turn feeds back into how ethical changes and political changes could happen. So that's kind of the very typical case. And then you have the philosophical cases. That's the kind of the third class, where you have the scientific, you have the ethical, political, and then you have the philosophical cases, where some philosophers specifically argue that certain concepts are not suitable for certain philosophical purposes. And and usually this kind of case is like this, more like the scientific one. It's proposing some sort of local changes. So it's not like saying, well, we should just abandon the concept altogether. But it's usually saying, well, some concepts, while they are good in everyday purposes, they are not good for philosophical purposes. So let's change it, right? And one kind of relatively famous example in philosophy is the notion of truth. So truth is, I mean, we talk about truth every day, right? And I think nobody would be crazy enough to say, let's just drop the notion of truth in everyday context. I mean, I'm sure some people would, but I mean, yeah. But then this proposal specifically is about saying, well, the notion of truth, as it's used in logic and semantics, is problematic. The idea is that, well, the notion of truth, if you assemble all the common beliefs we have about truth, or almost constitutive beliefs we have about truth, and you will find that actually they run into lots of contradictions and generates lots of paradoxes. There are many paradoxes surrounding the notion of truth, and the most famous one being the liar's paradox, right? So you can say, what I'm saying right now is false in this sentence, right? So it's a liar's paradox. It's true only if it's false only if it's true, right? So it can't be anyway. So the idea is, well, it generates us into a bunch of paradoxes, not just the liar's paradox, but also other paradoxes. And then the issue is, well, if that's the case, then we should use something slightly different, engineered, improved, when we're doing formal logic and formal semantics, while we keep the ordinary notion of truth for ordinary talk. So that's kind of the three classes of conceptual engineering that I'm concerned with. That's kind of a broad categorization of the topic, really.
So let's go into maybe something like truth more broadly, or more specifically. What is your take on truth? What do you deal with? Is it purely chronicling the change, or do you also deal with truth as a concept?
I mean, I deal with truth as a concept. I mean, I kind of primarily deal with truth as a concept because I don't know what truth is outside of a concept, really. So there are many in philosophy. There are many different accounts of truth, right, available, and I mean, at different historical periods, there are different trends for thinking about these kind of things. So there are historical periods where people kind of focus on concepts and they think philosophy kind of just is a study of concepts, right? I mean, my project, my PhD project is called Philosophy as Conceptual Engagement. So it's just kind of a test of the idea whether philosophy is primarily about conceptual engagement. But then I guess some people would object and say that philosophy isn't about conceptual engagement. I'm not talking about tables, I'm talking about the thing table, right? I'm not going to talk about quote unquote the concept of tables or the word of table, but really I'm talking about the things, right? And similarly, some people would want to say that when we talk about truth, we're not talking about the concept of truth, quote unquote, but rather we're talking about the thing, which is truth. But then I guess, for table, it's easier, right? But for truth, it's much more obscure, because if you don't think about the concept of truth, then how do you just kind of, what is there? What is truth? Can you see it, touch it, smell it? It's not like exactly like any other physical entities, which you can just kind of almost ordinarily, in a commonsensical way, assume their existence and talk about them. Right? So in lots of cases in philosophy, I think we engage with concepts first, and the concepts are like our lenses, right? And when they work well, you can just see through them. But lots of the times you also have to reflect on your lenses and see if they distort anything, see if they deliver you the things that they really do. But anyway, so back to the topic. I think of truth as a sort of concept, primarily. And then whether there is a kind of a substantive property of truth is another matter, right? So kind of that's what I think. And then for the people who want to do the conceptual engineering of truth, again, I'm not kind of committing myself to that view. I'm slightly more ambivalent. But for people who want to they want to do the conceptual engineering, what they want to say is that the concept of truth is so confused that it doesn't really get us to anything real in the world. Right. So the concept, they think of it as associated with a range of criteria, right? A criterion of application. And then, but if you try to apply the criterion, you'll find that they all kind of mashed up. They all enter into contradiction with one another. So and when you have a very contradictory set of criterion, how are you going to find some property in the world that this concept this concept will get you to, right? So it doesn't really get you to anything almost. And that's kind of like that. So there might be various properties in the world that your concept of truth is tracking, but there is not, definitely for them, there is not one thing that it's tracking. Yeah.
Right. And so I think that's also a really important metaphysical point, right? Is that if it's all tracking one specific thing, if every potential concept is moving towards truth or away from truth, then you have truth as a given point, as opposed to truth being something descriptive. It's an attribute that you might assign as something being closer or farther away from truth. Mm-hmm. But then again, you still have a point where you are saying truth is, and you can sort of attempt to undo that point and just say, okay, there are particular features of this bit of information that have tendencies towards predictive accuracy. And we might say the predictive accuracy is self-defined, therefore truth isn't a solid point, but every individual piece of information has its own trajectory of accuracy given the endpoint that's predefined.
Right. Exactly. So that's kind of one way of, that's one kind of nice way of putting it. And also, like in philosophy, another closely related engineering project is the engineering of knowledge, the concept of knowledge. So because, knowledge is kind of easier to talk about because it's more like epistemic and So, and then philosophers used to think that knowledge is one thing, right? They used to think you can provide a right analysis of knowledge. Since Socrates and Plato, philosophers have this famous analysis of knowledge saying knowledge just is justified true belief, right? That's kind of the analysis of knowledge. They think that is what knowledge is. It gets at one thing, justified true belief, right? And that's kind of... that's a conceptual analysis of the concept of knowledge. It's necessary and sufficient definition. But then in the early 60s, philosophers realized that, that doesn't work. As knowledge, counterexamples were given, and then you know that knowledge isn't justified true belief anymore. And then the issue is, what then, right? And the philosophers have kind of repeatedly tried to offer alternative definitions of knowledge. They don't really work that well. You can always find counterexamples. And then that kind of leads some philosophers to reflect along the vein of conceptual engineering. They want to say, well, actually, let's stop for a minute and think about the concept of knowledge. And why does it have to denote one property, right? And then, so this kind of leads us back into a different way of thinking. So they would instead of asking what is the necessary and sufficient definition of knowledge, they would ask what is the function of the concept of knowledge, right? Why imagine a human society without a concept of knowledge? Why do they need to have it somehow? Right, so this is kind of a way of philosophical thinking. Again, that relates us back to some sort of genealogical inquiry almost, even though it's one that kind of blends fiction and history. But so if we have a human society without the concept of knowledge, why do we need to have one? And the notion is, knowledge serves various functions. The concept of knowledge serves various functions, right? It kind of helps us to identify reliable knowers. You can talk about, I don't know when the meeting is, but she knows, right? So I can ask her. So it kind of identifies reliable knowers. It helps you as a norm of assertion, as a norm of action, etc. So if I know that the bank will not close, or the bank will be closed at 5, then I am justified in, just kind of like go to the bank at 4 or something, right? So it's kind of, that's identifying various functions that the concept of knowledge will serve in our life. And then once you have identified that, you may ask, is one thing good at serving all these functions? Or actually, when we are talking about knowledge, we're talking about a slightly more loosely correlated set of properties, right? So if you're identifying reliable knowers, does it have to be that one thing, only one property only helps you to identify reliable knowers? Or maybe in different circumstances, you can identify reliable knowers in different ways, right? Reliable informers, not reliable knowers, that's kind of like circular almost, but identify reliable informers in different ways, right? And then so it's like previously we thought it's one single concept almost kind of opens up, right? It becomes an umbrella term almost, and then it gets us to a range of different properties. And then it's good, it's precisely useful because it is so vague, because, lots of things can count as knowing, so we can, so that it's useful, right? So again, it's kind of get at some sort of pragmatism in the sense that in like precision is not what we seek in our everyday life. What we seek is usefulness, where we want to navigate ourselves successfully through our lives with all our aims and purposes and stuff. And then maybe sometimes a vague concept serves that purpose well. So it kind of, that's kind of one very lengthy way of,
I think underlying all the 3 examples that you gave and also throughout the a specific kind of things that you're talking to her, a specific kind of concepts you're talking to her now. I just heard you saying many times needed, or it has a function, or it's so there is all of it. And engineering also implies that there is an end goal, that it's functional, right? So
oftentimes, yeah.
So yeah, okay. The question would be just are there useless concepts, but for what I got here, it's so far, concepts must fulfill a function, and I would guess that this function has some relationship to social function. So we have to agree and understand each other, what we're talking about, what we're discussing, and what we are trying to define as something that we both are trying to talk about. But I don't know if that's a good take on it.
I think that's
and if there is an exception, if there is concepts that are useless, if I can just have fun.
Probably. So I think, I'm not committed very strongly to a view relating to function here. So I guess it's nice to talk about concepts having functions, but then it's not necessarily that, first of all, every concept must have a function. And second of all, it's not that one concept necessarily has one proper function or whatever. A concept can have many, many different functions, right? And some of the functions we might want to preserve, some of the functions we might not, right? Some concepts may function to oppress a certain group of people, for example. And then that's something we might want to do without. So functional analysis of concepts and assessment of those functions are a crucial part of conceptual engineering. But is that necessary? I don't necessarily have a take on that. It's there might well be some more creative the concepts that a bit more creative, a bit more, say, literary. They they don't necessarily fulfill much practical need or function. They could well be. I'm not taking a strong stand on it, but I don't think I have to. Almost.
Yeah, I would say that something like a creative, artistic function, something like fun, these are all functions that a concept serves. I don't know if that makes them useless. I think that maybe a useless concept, if we actually took time to think about it, I can't really think about it on the fly, but I don't know if actually a useless concept exists. I don't know if you could actually think of a useless concept, because even if you think of a useless concept, you're thinking of that concept as a function of explaining uselessness, right? So I don't think that you could get to that point. If you think of a concept because it's readily available, that means that there's some function that it served, even as a placeholder. That would be my immediate take. I would have to think about it for longer. But how you explain the function is kind of how I think about truth and knowledge, right? Is that I don't take truth to exist, and I think that knowledge is predicated on truth. Therefore, I don't take knowledge necessarily to exist. I think you can root everything in belief. But I do think that there's a strong functional component to the idea of truth, so that I can explain things quickly. Oh, yes, that's true, or oh, she knows. Therefore, what I'm doing is I'm declaring a belief, basically. And I think that's the core element of the thing, that if anything exists, the belief is there. I'm at least declaring it. And therefore, knowledge then is something like my declaration of the belief of justifications, right? And then I could maybe elaborate or expand upon what the justifications are. But this would essentially be the pragmatic use cases of certain concepts, which then have a different place, I would say, in some kind of loose hierarchy that I'm thinking about on the fly, than something like beliefs, because then truth and knowledge sort of roll up into my concept of beliefs. So do you ever think about something like hierarchies of concepts or relationships between concepts, and their existence being predicated upon the existence of other concepts that are sort of necessary for the relationships to exist?
Right, that's actually very interesting. So obviously, concepts, they are very closely related to one another, but I haven't really thought about it in a more kind of hierarchical way, right? So I guess there are lots of philosophical traditions that will want to say kind of concepts are hierarchical, in the sense that, for example, what you said could be one sense of it, and what other people, there are some metaphysicians who want to say that some concepts are really, really fundamental, and then, as in the fundamental ontological category of the world. And then other concepts, they are kind of somehow built up from these concepts. I'm not really sure. I'm kind of more taking a view that concepts are just kind of a very messy toolbox, and then we have lots of stuff. And then maybe there are some sort of functional dependence for some concept upon others, but then it doesn't necessarily get us to some more substantial kind of hierarchy, right? So kind of concepts, they are more kind of related in a web rather than in a hierarchy. That's kind of how I see that.
Right, as opposed to something like the biological concepts, like the concept of cat versus the concept of mammal. You have something like a concept which contains another concept.
Yeah.
And so the degree of difference between the concepts are essentially zero, but then once you stray outside the
concept... What do you mean by degree of difference?
Like if I'm able to measure concepts, so if I try to define what a concept is, then maybe if I try to quantitatively define it, I could list a set of dimensions along which the concept might be defined.
Yeah.
So I could say it has certain dimensions along which if it falls within these points along these multiple dimensions, then the space in between these dimensions is the range, the space of the concept itself.
Right.
And so you could think about something as like every concept holds some kind of conceptual space, some kind of space within sets of dimensions. And so you could compare concepts based on the dimensions that they hold, and whether or not concepts can even be compared with similar dimensions would maybe facilitate some understanding of the degree of difference between those concepts.
Right.
Whereas dog and cat clearly would be measured along the same dimensions for the most part. Then you could make some sense. You could say something like a cat with a uterus. You could measure something like the health of the uterus, but you couldn't measure that the health of the uterus as a dimension for a cat without a uterus, something like that. Right, so you have you have sort of funny dimensions where every sub-concept is going to have some dimensions along which there is incompatibility.
Right.
But the degree to which concepts share dimensions is probably something like their degree of similarity, even if along those dimensions they fall in very different places.
That's very interesting. Okay, yeah. I have to read a bit more, actually. I'm not that familiar with the conceptual space theory. But yeah, but again, I kind of always have this suspicion that similarities, again, I don't really know. I have to try to find it out. But lots of times I just have the feeling, as Wittgenstein said, everything is, I guess, in some way similar to everything else and dissimilar to everything else. So similarity, it's something that's just very, very easy to find. But I'm not sure how you can use that concept, so how you can use like similarity to build up a more systematic way of looking at relations between concepts. But yeah, again, I have to look it up, right? So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. My analogous reference for Wittgenstein quote is the William James quote.
Nice.
Yeah, differences of degree are different, are all different along different degrees. So there's like, so you have, I can't call up the exact quote, even though I've quoted it 1,000 times. But basically all differences are differences of degree among different degrees of difference with no difference. That's the quote.
He did quote it 1,000 times.
Yeah, there you go. That's really the exact quote.
That's nice.
So then when you look at, every relationship, so every concept that you can have is going to be different along some difference of degree rather than difference of kind.
Yeah.
And maybe what seems like a difference of kind is actually different degrees of difference. Right. And so
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, that sounds right. That sounds right to me.
Do you think there are concepts that appeal to some psychological mechanisms, instances, something along the lines of some concepts are easier to remember, some concepts are they are rooted on some psychological appeal to it. Do you think that that's a thing?
I mean, yeah, I think that could very well be. I mean, I don't take any. Again, I'm kind of more ignorant on the science side, so I'm not going to take any very strong commitment to that. But what I want to say again, it's from a more pragmatic point of view, right? So if you are a kind of a transcendental philosopher, if you Kant, right, for example, you would think there are necessary concepts almost. There are concepts that are crucial for thinking at all, right? As this thinking discursive being, there has to be some sort of necessary precondition almost, some concept that you have to possess. But again, kind of, even when I'm not taking a stand on that, there is a pretty good claim to be made that human beings, given the creatures that human beings are, some concepts are so expressive of their need and concern that even, again, it's kind of to use my previous idea, right? Even in a society without those kind of concepts, they are almost bound to arise. In any of the slightly complex societies, they are bound to arise, right? So I guess there are claims to be made that, there is this 1990 book by Edward Craig called Knowledge and the Function knowledge in the state of nature. So that's kind of arguing that, knowledge is kind of a necessary human concept almost, right? But not from the more transcendental vein of Kant, but just more from the practical necessities of human beings. And then in a 2002 book, a great philosopher, Bernard Williams, wrote another book called Truth and Truthfulness. So in that book, again, it's in relation to the concepts that we have discussed, right? So he talks about the concept of truth and truthfulness being necessary for human societies, right? So again, you can have the sort of fictional genealogy of why they're bound to arise given certain of our needs. And then he also traces the actual history of different versions of notion of truth and truthfulness in different human societies. And then you can have another example that's actually very interesting, is the notion of liberty. And then it relates to a political debate that Bernard Williams later had with Dworkin, with another American political philosopher and legal theorist. So the idea is that Williams thinks that the notion of liberty expresses something very, very fundamental to human concern, i.e. the concern that we want to do things unobstructed, right? So we have, as rational agents, we have various goals and aims, and then what we want is for them to be realized unobstructed. So it's kind of a primitive notion. It hasn't really built much ethical significance into it, but it's kind of something that we human beings almost necessarily want, right? And then anyway, so there is this political debate that there's this debate between Dworkin and Williams. Dworkin thing. So there is this famous tendency between liberty and famous tension between liberty and equality. So lots of times you can say that if we have too much liberty, we have too much freedom to do whatever we want, then there wouldn't be that much equality. And then vice versa. If we have we want to have a very sort of egalitarian view, a very egalitarian picture, then it's kind of almost necessary to constrain our liberty in certain ways. I think it has been realized throughout history, but in the later era, it's Isaiah Berlin, the British kind of intellectual historian and philosopher. He raised this kind of very serious question about the tension between liberty and equality. And then Dworkin wants to say, well, but then he thinks integrity is a very important virtue, both in political philosophy and legal theory. So he thinks that, well, it's not really good that two of our very important political goods come into conflict, right? It's not a desirable state. So he proposes something that we could regard almost as a conceptual engineering of the notion of liberty. So he wants to say, well, we shouldn't really understand liberty as we did before, i.e., just to do something unobstructed. Rather, we should understand liberty as a sort of more constrained notion, to be almost subsume the notion of liberty under the notion of equality, as it were, right? So to say that liberty, you are only free to do things within the confines of your basic equal rights or whatever, right? And that, so he proposes a kind of conceptual engineering to make our political ideals more congruent. That's the idea. And then Williams wants to say, but that kind of is not so good because it detaches the concept of liberty from the very original need and concern that the concept rises out of, right? So we have some very fundamental needs and concerns, and then the concept of liberty rises out of that and expresses that. And then in this case, we shouldn't just think of this as very easily engineerable because, again, they express something very fundamental. So for Williams, it's better to keep the concept, to recognize that they are in tension, to recognize that often in pursuit of one, we are kind of pursuing it at the expense of another. And then that this is kind of a fundamental condition of human society, that we have to do all these trade-offs for these plural ideals. And then he thinks that's a better way to do things. So it's an interesting debate in conceptual ethics almost, right? So it's kind of like, what is the ethics of using changing concepts? So yeah, It's kind of very lengthy.
Yeah, I think we can maybe have a brief digression towards this exact topic, right? Because I think that's a really interesting topic. Maybe you might also have some interesting stuff to say about that, because I think maybe liberty is something that we don't necessarily need as a concept. If we have equity in a system, then ideally everybody will have the things they need. And so this idea of liberty, to me, is always something that's very individualistic and is almost a hedge against society itself and what society can provide.
Yeah.
So then if we look at maybe equity, which is accounting for equality with the inclusion of variables, particularly the temporal scale, then maybe what we can do is do away with something like the notion of liberty, build a system that is equitable. So then we have something like what everybody is able to do is something that doesn't infringe on the equity or doesn't impose on this ideal of equity that we're building in society. Do you have a take on that? Do you think about the concepts themselves?
I mean, yeah, I think that's a very interesting way of thinking about things. And we've talked about this, right? So I guess it's... I guess it kind of also depends on the assessment of how much what, not necessarily what human beings are like fundamentally, but what modern human beings are like in the society that we are now, right? So oftentimes when we talk about these kind of things, we talk about a more almost revolutionary, more radical way of thinking. Then the issue is the interesting issue always is like, to what extent is that realistic? To what extent can we move in a conceivable way to that sort of status, right? So it might not necessarily be that liberty is something that's so again, I'm kind of against appealing to a very brute human nature, right? Just to say, well, just biologically human beings are like that. I'm not really sure, but I'm kind of remaining agnostic about it. And then the issue is, even if we weren't, and I mean, given all this history of modernity, of enlightenment, of all this emphasis on human liberty, of this kind of general, let's say, Western tradition of this political tradition of liberalism and this moral tradition of, say, Kantianism and all that sort of thing, I guess that kind of pulls us towards one direction of recognizing, as you said, some sort of individualism almost, right? Some sort of individualism. And that's kind of always the presumption of where we begin, right? Individuals with their distinct wants and needs and concerns trying to coexist in a society. I guess that's kind of in a way that's kind of like a definitive feature of many political theory almost, right? So individuals trying to coexist in a society, and they try to find a way of nicely and peacefully coexist with one another despite their different needs and wants and beliefs. And so, yeah, to what extent can we say, well, let's kind of do away with that, and then let's not want to just be unobstructed in any of our aims and needs, and just to build equity into. I mean, I think it's probably possible, but of course that would require it's theoretically possible. How realistic, I'm not really sure, right? I would find that sort of idea interesting, but then like what kind of education would we need to gradually change our perspective of the world and to transition us into that sort of society is an interesting and very practical question that, I have no idea of.
Yeah, and I guess this is an interesting aspect of conceptual engineering, where you could do possibly the work to engineer the concept of equity to include all of the benefits of liberty without the sort of individualism. But then what about when you're actually doing the engineering at a societal level, and you say, okay, maybe liberty is a function of people's fatalism about other human beings. Yeah. There's sort of a pessimism about what other human beings do. So therefore, regardless of where you are in the political spectrum, as a hedge against the political system you're living in, you fight for liberty because you think liberty will give you the rights that the political system you live under doesn't give you. And there's this sort of interesting interplay where if people have more faith in the system, which you can't just produce or manufacture, and faith in the system generally is predicated upon faith in other human beings. There's something about,
that's true.
I think a positive belief that individuals have can build a society that is something like utopian, even if it's very far, that you have faith in other human beings. Right. Then possibly you can build something that looks like an education system that is non-fatalistic, which then downplays the role of liberty.
Yeah. Education that is fatalistic. Yeah, probably. I don't know. But I guess there are also different kind of values in play, right? And there is also, I guess, some sort of value in remaining a bit more vigilant towards the political system that there is.
Sure.
And to not put too much trust in them. And so again, I think there are lots of very fundamentally, and also like there is all this danger of utopia and more utopianistic thoughts. So I guess, so these are the concerns to be balanced, right? So of course we want to kind of trust human beings in that we can build a good society, but then I guess that sort of ultimate trust, what that translates into the current concern, what current practical strategy and attitudes that we should adopt, is a bit more complicated issue. Yeah, but I'm more interested in raising that issue rather than just kind of giving an answer. I don't really have that much of an answer, really. Yeah.
So one of the things I love about the work that you're doing is also the benefit for cognitive scientists, just scientists in general. And I think that a lot of scientists ignore the history of science, the philosophy of science, to the detriment of the progress of science. Something like, so we invent a lot of concepts, and we invent a lot of concepts which then, because they are able to provide us a way to measure a phenomenon.
Yeah.
So we identify something like a phenomenon, we identify changes in the phenomenon, and then we name it. So time, we invent clocks, we have time, we invent a thermometer, we have temperature, we invent a Geiger counter, and we have radiation.
Yeah.
So there's something like an argument that says, okay, maybe these things exist, or at least the phenomena are something that's perceivable, or at least we can build tools that generate the experience of these phenomena. However, I take obviously the most sort of epistemic, least metaphysical commitment of the things. But when we move from the phlogiston, which is an element that combusts, to actually understanding that molecules exist, and we understand the interplay between oxygen and carbon, then we say, okay, well, maybe our understanding of things, we were so sure that ether and the phlogiston existed, maybe our concepts of things are expandable, maybe they're more fluid, maybe they'll change, maybe there are revolutions and they change entirely. The concept of planet has changed in our lifetime, for example. And I remember there was something, so the most interesting things, the interesting ones for me are things like time and pain, which you and I had discussed. Maybe we can discuss some more of the concept of will as well, like free will or a lack of free will. But before we go into any of that, you had mentioned a term that sort of explained the plasticity of a concept.
Yeah.
Can you go into that again?
Right. Okay. Sorry, go ahead.
No.
No. I'm just talking.
An open texture. Sorry.
Yeah, open texture.
Right.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So I mean, lots of the times, open texture is a notion proposed by an Austrian physicist and also philosopher called Friedrich Waismann. He was associated with the Vienna Circle at the time. He was associated with Wittgenstein. And then later the Oxford philosophers, and then some people have argued that maybe there is kind of some sort of influence between Weismann and Wittgenstein coming up for this concept of open texture. But anyway, open texture is the words of Weismann. And then the idea is essentially that, it's again, nothing terribly new, but it's interesting to crystallize that into a concept. The idea is like concepts are not closed, as it were. They're open. They're always open to the future. And then, so that you cannot just define a concept entirely. So you define it entirely closely, such that whatever might happen, you would be able to judge whether this concept applies or not. And then the idea is that is kind of not possible, right? So there are always going to be kind of unexpected circumstances which demand you to make a decision almost to say whether this concept applies. And then I think that the kind of the famous example was that imagine there was a cat. And then, okay, so you see there is a cat, and then the next second it kind of disappeared, or whatever, it just blown into the size of a building or whatever. And then you kind of face a choice. It's kind of an absurd example, of course. But then the idea, but we'll see more realistic examples later, especially when we talk about pain. But yeah, the idea is that in these kind of cases, you have to decide what you want to say. It's not that your previous very smooth definition and criterion applies automatically, but you have to decide, is that a cat or not? If the cat is poisonous, is that a cat or not? If it if it just does all sorts of weird things, disappear at will and then appear at will, is that a cat, right? So anyway, so the idea is like it's meant to be pretty absurd, but the idea is that you can never really prevent all the surprises that the future will offer. So the concept always have an open texture. It's kind of open to the future, and then given what things the future will happen, it would kind of make a difference, right? And then I guess one of the more realistic example would be like something like death, right? So previously it's very easy, it's very simple. All the relevant features of death happen almost at the same time. But nowadays we have all sorts of very fancy, very advanced technology which allows you to be brain dead without with the circulatory system still working. So anyway, so you can have all these kind of things, which brings in the issue of what counts exactly as death, right? So it was previously closed, but now it's kind of becomes a bit more open and up for negotiation. Do you want to?
I'm thinking about it. It's
interesting. Yeah, one thing that we had spoken about before as well that I think is super interesting is, what happens when you reanimate the circulatory system and you get brain activity. So a couple of months ago, physicians figured out a way to restart the circulatory system of a cadaver in order to preserve the longevity of the organs, to improve organ donation, basically, as a process. And there's been an ethical debate about whether or not this is the right thing to do, because then it raises questions about whether or not the individual is actually dead. Of course, sort of scientifically, from my interpretation, my belief is that when the individual is dead, they're dead. So when you sort of re-engage the circulatory system, it doesn't change anything. One of the interesting things that physicians did in order to avoid potentially mitigate at least some of the ethical concerns is to sever the circulatory system's attachment to the brain, so the circulatory system's re-engagement wouldn't generate brain activity, which of course wouldn't mean that the individual is alive. The brain would just be activating because the brain is just chemistry and electricity anyway, and you're just sort of restarting the process. So some chemistry and electricity is going to go on. Technically, you get some kind of brain activity, but it doesn't mean anything like the individual is back. And so these are sort of interesting ways in which the concept of conceptual engineering can be very relevant in a contemporary debate.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
And then I guess people, because we are doing it already, we're doing it necessarily almost, it's good to be a bit more conscious about it, right? So it's good to do it a bit more self-consciously. So you need to realize that this is what you're doing. You'd better realize what consequences are kind of there when you're trying to engineer a concept. And then, if we're doing it already, so we should kind of bring more concerns into it, right? So especially when it comes to death, I think that I read the link that you sent me. It's actually terribly interesting, right? And then there is this, I think American, medical journal, and then there are people arguing. I've kind of tracked down some of the stuff. There are people arguing back and forth. There are people saying, well, if you are restarting the circulatory system but only blocking the access to the brain, then it's kind of it's weird. And then you're like, well, can't you just put some person in a permanently vegetative state, and then you artificially block the flow to the brain? Wouldn't that kind of be the same thing? I forgot where exactly the argument was, but it's kind of terribly interesting, right? In these kind of cases, my intuition also goes if someone's dead, they're dead. But then there are lots of the criterion issues, right? So the criterion was circulatory death and brain death. And then the issue is, well, if you restart the circulatory system, it's very, very, very interesting.
There's something lingering with me since the beginning, and now that you mentioned the death example, it's just if you ask me if I have to use a concept, well, we pass by the road and there's an animal and it doesn't move, and you ask me, is it dead? I said, yes, it is dead. I just use the concept of that in that situation, right? But if you ask me to elaborate on what it is death, I would probably give you a list of other concepts of it doesn't move, it doesn't breathe, it doesn't have a circulatory system working, it doesn't pump blood through the body, the brain doesn't work. So there is a list that comes with it, right? And it makes sense that we use compartmentalize the meaning of things. And since the beginning, we were talking about concepts almost like tokens, right? So Johan mentioned hierarchizations of concepts, or concepts that can be traced back to something that contains them. You mentioned that they are interrelated. There are even some concepts that might only exist if, by the interrelationship that they have with other concepts. But we still kind of back and forth talking about something that sounds like tokens, but we know that they are not. So that has been lingering with me. It just comes back to brings me back to things that I learned on symbolical anthropology, or Victor Turner. It's just things like symbols or meanings that can only exist. For example, if they have a counterpart, you're not gonna have you cannot gonna have some meaning if you cannot define what that meaning is not. So you have to say that is not that. That's why it is it. So even on this situation, you have at least two parts of it, right? So since the beginning, I am dealing
two
with
parts.
the back.
What do you mean by two parts?
The thing that is not.
Yeah.
So the thing is only is because it's not that.
Yeah, of course.
So it has to have something else to be entangled with.
Yeah.
Right. So since the beginning, we're like being forth and back with just using the word concept almost like token.
Yeah.
And in the case of that, that came like rushing to me, just like, yes, I'm never gonna, like, if you ask me to define what's the concept of that, I would give you a list of things that and then in the case that you mention, I would say, well, no, that's not that, because it doesn't fulfill this or that criteria on my list.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. But exactly, I mean, so what you have said, I think. So on the kind of the list of criteria thing, right? I guess the issue that I want to talk about. So first of all, like the counterpart, of course, yes. So a concept have to have some sort of criteria, right? Something that fall under the concept, something that don't really fall under the concept, right? Mm-hmm. So that's kind of like obvious. So you have the concept of death, and then you have the stuff that are living, basically. Mm-hmm. And I guess the issue appears precisely when the boundary, if you think of a concept as drawing a sort of a boundary, almost drawing a cut, right? In philosophy, sometimes you talk about concepts as carvers of possible worlds, right? So there are loads of possible situations and how they kind of carve up possible worlds. And concepts are not, propositions are, but again, there's kind of a clear way of separating these. And then the problem is, well, what used to be a clear, sharp boundary, what used to be a clear, sharp cut, now becomes a bit fuzzy, right? Now it's kind of not so clear anymore. And then the precise issue was that so you have a list of intuitions, but then what if all these intuitions come apart, right? So what if something that stopped circulatory system but could move, right? For example, just kind of like using a toy example that you gave me, right? So you have a list of intuitive criteria, but what if some of the criteria become, so again, right, the issue was previously probably all of the criteria are satisfied either together or they're satisfied or not satisfied as a group together, right? But now the issue is, what if some of the criteria are satisfied and some other criteria are not satisfied? And then that kind of get you into some of the issue, because you have to redefine, you have to draw the boundary a bit more precisely, right? Previously, it's kind of like nice, but now it kind of opens up, become fuzzy, and then now it kind of drives you to do a bit more negotiation, do a bit more thinking, and then think what would count as death, right? Again, I wouldn't say there is a metaphysical thing which is death. Again, it's a concept that we use, right? And then among all these list of criterion, we have to decide what is and is not important to us. So I guess that's kind of the issue there.
Yeah, I guess the way I think about it, this is why, again, conceptual spaces end up being really relevant to me in how I think about things, is if I was to build something like a checklist for death, if everything meets the criterion that I set, then I have something like a prototypical case of death.
Yeah, exactly.
So once I deviate from that checklist, so it hits 9 items out of 10 or 6 items out of 10, I deviate from that central point. So the prototypical point, the distance from the prototypical point generates a more fuzzy case.
Yeah.
And in this case, we get back to all concepts are interrelated. There's always a difference of degree.
Yeah.
We don't have sort of stark differences of kind. To me, differences of kind are sort of imagined. That you can set arbitrary delineations, but there are always going to be cases on either side of that line. Right. So
arbitrary, but also sometimes practical, right? Anyway,
yeah, pragmatic for sure.
Yeah, pragmatic.
Yeah. You're right. And that arbitrary is maybe too strong of a word.
Yeah.
There are sort of pragmatic delineations we can make, but then the lines that we draw, and perhaps everybody's line, might be in a slightly different place. So even the pragmatic lines that we might verbally agree on might be different once I give us cases.
Yeah.
Like what's right and wrong. We might think that we agree, and then with specific use cases, we might disagree on the finer points.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
Therefore we see, okay, our lines aren't exactly identical.
Yeah, exactly. That's kind of, yeah.
I mean, with the relevance to tokens, I think it is probably like semantically very similar in that how an anthropologist uses it is going to serve a very similar function for what an anthropologist needs. Whereas what a philosopher means when they use concepts, it's serving their needs. I think maybe the needs are different, but functions maybe are similar in that it delineates how individuals think about things. Mm-hmm. And in that sense, you have also like sort of linguistic categories where the fact that no sentence can exist on its own. You need a whole linguistic structure. You need a web of meaning in order to construct a sentence. In that same sense, you need a whole web of concepts in order to generate even one concept.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, right. Yeah, I think so. Yeah. So I also that's kind of like the issue that gets into like philosophical semantics when we talk about representation, right? And I guess lots of the issue with the more philosophical representationalism is the sort of the issue of atomism almost, because if you think of concepts as meaningful only when they represent something, if that's where that's kind of why our thoughts and our words are meaningful, that obviously their thoughts and words are closely related, then the issue is that technically you could have someone with only one concept, right? There's no problem. Suppose I only know tables in this world, and then suppose I can reliably differentiate cases where there are tables and cases there are no tables, and then they would say, well, then you count as possessing the concept of table. And then so in principle, it's very easy to conceive of some intelligent being only possessing one concept. But I think that's kind of an absurd consequence, right? So if you have one concept, you have to have a bunch of concepts. So, I mean, it's kind of digressing back to the stuff that we talked about earlier. So that's why I say, like, representation in a thinner sense is good, but in a more kind of loaded sense, I'm a bit more skeptical. Yeah. So anyway.
Would you want to move on to something like free will?
Okay, sure.
What do you have to say about it?
Yeah, I mean...
As a concept, even at a meta level, more than maybe... free will itself.
Yes, I mean, it's kind of like there's the philosophy 101. So the concept of free will is famously debated because of its tension with what's known as determinism, right? So determinism is the idea that basically, according to physics, everything happening in this world is determined somehow, right? I don't think of that as the kind of the real source of that issue, but let's kind of run with it. It's the more canonical formulation of the issue. And then the idea is you have free will on the one side, which says, well, we can do whatever we want. We could have done otherwise. Whenever we make a choice, we could have chosen otherwise. Then we have free will, right? On the other hand, we have, and then free will is very closely connected to all the responsibility and all these other sorts of notions, right? And our society is almost built on that. It's like if you do something out of, well, your free will, then you have to be responsible for it. If you do something bad, then you are liable to be blamed or punished based on your action. But if you do something bad when you are, for example, just coerced, right, then your responsibility wouldn't be as high as if you are just doing it totally out of your own will. So that's kind of on the one side. And then on the other side, you have physics telling you that everything is determined. Or maybe if not determined, quantum physics, whatever, you get some sort of randomness. But still, that doesn't really get you to free will, right? So it kind of gets you a more or less kind of deterministic worldview picture.
You get like an interdependent probabilistic relationship.
Yeah, sure, of course. Yeah, right. That's that. And then, so they come into tension, right? If the physics is true, if what physics tell you is true, that means essentially all the stuff in your brain, you have neurons causing another neuron to do certain things, and then et cetera, they're all basically physics. So they're all kind of determined. So there is no room for free will, right? What happened could only happen one way, and you couldn't have done otherwise. So that's the tension. And then out of that tension, some people propose something called compatibilism. Some people could propose something that says, well, I mean, actually, we should think of them as being compatible, really. We shouldn't have a notion of free will that is so strong that it contradicts physics. That's kind of the idea. So what's interesting about this case is that there are issues of conceptual engineering involved. So what's the debate that's most interesting to me is that the neurobiologist Robert Sapolsky had a new book out last year called Determined, The Science of a Life Without Free Will. I think that's the title. And then, so basically what he says is very typical kind of the incompatibilist, so the more hardcore determinist way of saying things. So he says, well, we are obviously entirely determined by the past. Therefore, we do not have free will. So it's an illusion, right? Human societies have been thinking that we can do whatever we want, but actually that's not true. And then therefore, he argues that we should kind of abandon lots of the moral practices that we have been practicing, right? That's the idea. And then, so another like old supervisor of mine, he wrote a review of that book in New Yorker. And then he took the compatibilist line. And then when he reviews that book, he kind of explicitly phrased this whole thing as a sort of conceptual negotiation. So the idea is, well, so suppose you want to kind of scientifically explicate a concept. So our ordinary concept of freedom of the will are kind of vague, right? So, and then you provide a definition. You provided a definition which you take to be precise, to be scientifically testable, and to capture what we kind of meant by talking about freedom of will. And then his issue is, well, but is your concept really what we really use and what we really care about and what we really need, right? Again, it kind of comes back to care and need and concern, all that sort of thing. And then he kind of reminds us there is this kind of traditional Oxford philosopher called Strawson talking about this debate. And then the line is this, right? So we want to draw a line between actions that are coerced and actions that are uncoerced, basically, right? We have to draw that line. If you did something bad, we would do it when you are sleepwalking. We would do it because you're drunk. We would do it because you are sober and you totally did it out of your free will, or somebody threatened you that if you don't do it, something very bad will happen to your family or whatever, right? So there are kind of various different kinds of circumstances. And in each and every one of these circumstances, we want to say that there are kind of almost different degrees of freedom of will, and we should treat these cases differently, right? So we want to mark some relevant distinctions in our society. And then the issue is, okay, Sapolsky could say free will just means undetermined by the past. Could have done otherwise, whatever. And then if we define that way, sure, it doesn't exist, right? Science tells us that there's no such thing. But then his issue is, well, okay, so maybe your free will, your concept of free will doesn't exist. But what we miss it, is that the notion that we are going to miss, right? Maybe not. We still have to give a new concept, maybe free will, whatever, right? We kind of need to coin a new concept, which allows us to do the stuff that we want to do the stuff that we wanted to do and have been doing and, in a sense, well do, right? So we still need to distinguish between the cases that I just mentioned, and that's crucial to our life as a human life in a society, right? We still have to talk about different levels of responsibility in different cases, and then if you forbid us to talk about free will, then we're just going to talk about something else. And then, so the idea is kind of a reminder, right? So the notion of free will is not just kind of something you can explicate and say that it doesn't exist. Rather, lots of the times, it's very much tied to lots of the everyday concerns that we as human beings have. It's kind of almost like death in a way, right? So you can't just engineer death to say, let's engineer death to be whoever that's just brain dead, for example. Let's not care about the circulatory system. Let's just engineer death as someone who's has a brain death. And then the issue is, well, the notion of death, I mean, I'm not kind of saying whether that's viable or not, but it's just saying that you have to be considerate, because the notion of death is not a medical notion. It's not just a medical notion, right? It's a notion that has loads and loads of ramifications, the social, cultural, religious, legal ramifications in our everyday lives. And then you have to think about that. You have to think about the connection one concept have to the vast amount of concepts that that's useful in our everyday practices and stuff. So I mean, so to turn back to the free will, same idea, right? Free will connects to so many moral, ethical, broadly ethical concepts that we deem as very, very crucial to us living a human life. And to do away with that is kind of absurd for this kind of reviewer, right? So the idea is that we should be a bit more cautious in talking about the concept of free will and take lots of these factors into concern. So yeah, so it's kind of I think it's a very interesting paradigmatic case of conceptual negotiation. Different people proposes different versions of the concept. Again, the concept itself as an everyday concept is very vague, right? So there are different ways of kind of making it a bit more precise. And then why? Well, fundamentally, it comes down into a sort of ethical negotiation almost, right? It's like what allows us to live our life better. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting how you work, right? Because I appreciate that you account for the societal impact. There's something of like a sort of social pragmatism to the work that you're considering when you do conceptual engineering or when you're looking at the case studies. Because you can do sort of the raw conceptual engineering work of, say, what Sapolsky's trying to do, which is sort of abstract in that he's trying to redefine what free will is or isn't, or the fact that he's trying to deflate it entirely, say it doesn't necessarily exist.
Yeah.
The negotiation there is an appeal not necessarily from the scientific standpoint, but from the social standpoint, the pragmatic standpoint of, well, what is that going to mean for us if we do away with people's concept of free will? And I think that that's a really interesting way to look at it, because one thing that comes to mind is when we look at something like free will, all of the implications of will, just like all of the implications of liberty, end up potentially causing negative externalities. And I guess my concern is more the negative externalities that the term free will, like the term liberty, end up facilitating, in that potentially what we could do is remove people's notions, this need for punitivism and vilification of individuals whose behavior perpetuates outcomes or causes outcomes which are harmful to others. Yeah. Instead, what we could focus on is, okay, an individual's behavior caused a particular outcome. That outcome is undesirable or unacceptable, and therefore we need to look at a series of accountability without the punitivism, without the vilification, where the accountability might, say, take a period of time of rehabilitation and restoration. Mm-hmm. And so there we could achieve a system of justice because that is potentially more equitable because it accounts for individuals' context and how context shape behavior. So there, I think like we have this opportunity to then look at how cognitive science can inform our systems of justice, and then this debate could maybe go further. But again, there is that pragmatic limitation of a lot of people believe in punitivism. Believe that punitivism is the way to go. There's this sort of vindictive mindset.
Yeah, that's actually very interesting, right? So I guess there's always, the punitivism is also a flip side of regarding someone as an agent, which is a very interesting phenomenon, I think. So I guess the issue with this, so I guess that's what Sapolsky would say anyway, right? So we should be less punitive and more forgiving, and I think that's a valid ethical point, as it were. But then the issue is, if you do away with responsibility, how much of agency and humanness is preserved in our picture, right? And should we just regard human beings as objects? And that's kind of like, there is this vast issue, right? And that issue was originally raised in Peter Strawson's, like the Oxford philosopher's earlier paper on this kind of discussion. So the issue is, well, yeah, sometimes we treat human beings as objects, right? When they're totally drunk and we have to carry them home, for example, or we treat them just as a bunch of very heavy objects and let's just try to carry them home. And there are cases, very limited cases, where we can kind of take on a more not objective, that's the wrong word, but like objectual attitude almost towards human beings. But then the issue is that the attitude that we should take about human beings all the time, right? And then we should be, I agree, maybe we should be less punitive towards human beings. But then is that also kind of because we only treat them as cause and effects, and then we're just kind of like trying to remedy that? I guess it's pretty... it's pretty hard to advance a view which like proposes that we should just regard human beings as, objects and do things with them, like causally manipulate them to cause better outcomes. Basically, it's kind of the concern would be that's kind of a not very humanistic view of the world. Almost, it's scientifically certainly correct, but is that kind of how we human beings could live and coexist in a society and view each other in that sort of way, right? I guess that's the I mean, I view human beings as the sum total of the probabilities of complex systems, So, and it's sort of like this. Yeah, it's a kind of absurd because I wouldn't necessarily try to make that case in front of a legal structure that's trying to determine whether or not punitivism is right, because they would probably think that I'm a psychopath or something. But if you say, but if you look at human beings, if you say human beings, are the type of biological complexity that we see in human beings is specific to human beings, and we determine human agency as the manifestation of that degree of complexity, then you could say, okay, well, I have some kind of scientific understanding of what human beings are, and a way to account for human beings and agency in a sense that doesn't need free will, in that every individual maintains a different set of probabilities, or represents or is a manifestation of those different sets of probabilities. But that, again, like you said, that doesn't necessarily get us to a place where we can convince others that punitivism isn't the way to go. And also that's very interesting. I think there's this general philosophical question, which kind of, I think it's one of the deepest and most interesting philosophical question that I've been concerned with is the contrast between the, let's say, more third-personal objective scientific view versus the more first-personal, not necessarily subjective, I wouldn't use the word subjective, but more so from a humanistic point of view, first-personal, our picture of what our world is like. And I think that contrast between the two worlds is actually just a very deep contrast, right? So I think that's what I said earlier, that actually I think the problem of free will isn't really just an issue of free will versus determinism. Even if determinism is false, there would still be this problem, because the problem essentially is free will is something that we advance from a first-person point of view, right? We are human beings. We regard ourselves as agents, and we regard others as agents as well, and then we regard us as having free choice. And then the third person point of view, the more scientific, objective point of view, tells us, well, that's kind of not really the case. And then also, like, in terms of morality, say, right, when I advance some sort of moral claims, I fully believe that, you know, this is some sort of truth, right? Phenomenologically, it seems to me that this just is the truth almost, right? That you just can't kill a random human being, for example, right? And then, but then scientifically, you can also, you know, there's also all this evolutionary theories that just tell us that actually, well, it's not necessarily universally true. It's just something that, you know, there's some sort of disposition or capacity that that's evolved out of us for a need for human beings to live in a society or whatever, right? So it's kind of like, again, there is this discrepancy between the authority of, there's this discrepancy of authority between the first person view of the world, the first person moral view of the world, let's say, versus the third person moral view of the world. So I guess that's kind of one of the most interesting and deepest, like, philosophical problems, i.e. there is this clash of the two perspectives. And as modern human beings, that, you know, we are kind of disenchanted, as it were. We lived after the scientific revolutions and whatever, in physics and in biology, all sorts of things. And we live in this kind of modern society. And how much of the first person point of view, which a philosopher used to contrast these two things as the manifest image, i.e. the first person view, versus the scientific image, i.e. the kind of the more third person point of view. And then the clash of the two images, I think is very, very interesting. And I mean, it's something that's constantly at the back of my head and I don't really have an answer to. But also, yeah, you talk about it, right? So it's kind of like some people, I guess especially some scientists, right? They are more natural in that they can sort of integrate the stuff in the manifest image into the scientific image and see the world, I guess, more consistently in that sort of way. And then for some other people, I guess it's kind of less easy to do that. And then the issue becomes, again, how to reconcile these two, how to hold them together. Yeah.
So I guess there's something like a conceptual momentum, right? In that you have the two views informing one another and shaping one another.
Right.
And I think that the predominant portion of the view that causes the change is probably the more scientific one, in that it generates predictions. Individuals can see the prediction. But then, of course, there is a feedback loop in that many scientific theories have been overtly xenophobic, racist, exclusionary, and oppressive. And so all of these scientific views have had to undergo, for obviously the obvious benefit of the scientific theories, the improvement actually even scientifically of their predictive accuracy through this sort of public tribunal. And so the momentum shifts, but the momentum also impacts the scientific concept, so that the concept improves by virtue of the removal of something like its sterility or its inherent bias of the scientists themselves. But then you have something like the improvement over time. I think the reason why I'm optimistic that we might get conceptual changes that where the more third-person viewpoint imparts the beneficial components, not just moves us in the wrong direction, is that we move from points of like a God of the gaps, where you have a God and then God slowly shrinks to contain everything we can't yet explain. Individuals used to walk around believing the earth was flat, and that is phenomenologically probably the more accurate way to look at things. This floor is flat. But then we get to the point where almost every human being understands that the world is round, regardless of the fact that it makes actually no difference at all in their lives. For me, the earth is the center of the universe, and I cannot give a shit that it rotates around the sun. But most individuals on the planet accept that. And I think maybe we can get to changes where individuals understand that though they don't have free will, even I think that's probably as big of a change as God created the universe 1,000 years ago and Earth is at the center. This is probably as big of a conceptual change.
So it might exactly. It might be eventually possible, and then I mean it's maybe just our worldview that it's kind of generally very flexible as well, right? So it's not like set in stone. But then, I guess it's also hard for us to sort of envisage that sort of change, because we're still too much used to the more sort of, as I said, the manifest image of things, right? So I guess, I mean, it's radical imagination. Of course, it's possible. It takes a bit of radical imagination, but I'm not sure how far I could kind of realistically imagine myself living out that sort of view. I guess especially the contrast would be between the issue with whether the Earth is the center of the universe or whether the Earth is round. I guess in that sort of thing, as you said, right, it doesn't really have that much practical significance. I mean, it might have some sort of symbolic significance, religious significance, I don't really know. But I guess like regarding human beings as altogether without free will is kind of like a pretty, I would imagine that to be a pretty radical shift of view towards ourselves and also other human beings. But again, yeah, I'm not really sure. It's maybe it's just kind of a lack of imagination on my part almost.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. I suppose there's something similar when people determined that gods weren't in charge of everything around them. Then all of a sudden, actually free will was sort of constructed out of the receding of gods. And maybe then the new god is something like a probabilistic determinism, which then removes free will again. But maybe we can move on to something like pain.
Yeah, I mean, so like pain is I guess the kind of final example of pain would be interesting because again, so we used to think of pain as a kind of simple sensation, right? I mean, that's kind of the general commonsensical view of pain. It's a simple sensation, and there are, again, like as you said, there are a list of features of pain almost, right, that we use to identify pain. So we think of pain as having certain qualities, as locating somewhere in our bodies, and then we think of pain as being bad, paradigmatically bad. And then I guess the issue is that, sometimes we discover that all these kind of things also come apart, right? Again, it's the similar kind of thing. You have a list of criterion, you have a way of applying the concept, and then it kind of breaks apart. Not in all the cases, but there are some marginal cases where this view becomes problematic, right? And then we have to almost conceptually negotiate what a pain is. So what's an interesting example would be cases where people can. So basically, so we now know that there is a sensory discriminatory aspect of pain, and there is this motivational affective aspect of pain, right? Sensory discriminative, i.e. this pain feels burning or like a pinching or, whatever. So you can describe the quality of the pain, and you can describe, this pain happens in my foot or is in my arm or in my head somewhere, right? And then that's kind of the sensory discriminatory aspect. There is another aspect, which is the affective motivational aspect. So pain, you want to avoid pain. When you have pain, generally, let's say you want to avoid pain. And then the issue is, they could basically doubly dissociate in the sense that it's always possible to have one feature without the other. You can have the discriminatory sensory aspect of pain, i.e. you can distinguish what the pain feels like and where it occurs in your body, but then you don't necessarily think of it as bad. You don't even think of avoiding it. It's just like, it's there, Mm-hmm. And then the other way around, you can have something that makes you very annoying, but you have no way of locating the pain, or you can't really describe the sensory aspect of the pain. You don't have that sort of processing, but you just you're in this very irritated state, want to get rid of that pain. So I guess again, so this is not even a very new finding, but then as the biologists and kind of philosophers follow suit, as they start to pay attention to these kind of cases, the ordinary notion of pain also kind of opens up, and then you would want to ask, but which cases are really pain? Is there really one thing such as pain? Or if we look at the very complicated functional and processing system in our body and in our brain, maybe pain also opens up into various different features and very different things. And then the issue is what do we want to use to denote pain, and how should we discuss pain, all that sort of things. Yeah.
That sounds very contextual, right? So the list has a context on where some things will fall into the list and some things are irrelevant in the list. Mm-hmm. If you are a doctor, you're going to have a surgery, give an anesthesia to you. He asks you, are you feeling any pain?
Yeah.
What's relevant on the list is the sensorial aspect of it, right? He's not asking you if you are upset. But if you are a psychologist, and then he says, do you feel upset? Do you feel bothered by it?
Yeah.
You're not going to point to your finger and say, yes, I got a cut, to the psychologist. So the things that compose the list they are very contextual. It's not that there is no one list for the concept of pain. There will be several lists, and then you're going to apply them in different contexts.
Yeah. But then I guess the issue is even, so they are contextual for sure, but then even in certain, like even in one context, for example, you go to see a doctor, I guess to recognize that the pain is not simply this one thing would have pretty significant sort of implications. So like what kind of anesthesia that you would administer to the patient. Also, like there are different kind of anesthesia or analgesics, right? And then they would have different sorts of effects. And then some just kind of do away with the affective motivational aspect of it, but doesn't do away with the sensory and discriminatory aspect of it. But is that kind of a sensible thing? How exactly do you see pain, right? And also there is this argument that pain is not really a scientific kind, so to speak. So pain is not something that's kind of, it's a phenomenological kind, the ordinary way of talking about pain. So it's something that we generally feel, it's a certain class of feeling, but they might not form a scientific kind. So there are some people arguing, both biologists and philosophers, that arguing, well, saying that you are in pain, like itself, isn't really exactly very helpful. And then lots of the times, it's actually pain could have very, very different causes and very different like processing systems activated, or like they could be indicative of very different problems, right? So anyway, so there are just all this kind of discussion of whether pain as a very vague sort of concept, everyday concept, would be a crucial concept in scientific theorizing.
So I'm going to go reductionist for a moment, just for the sake of the conversation, right?
Yeah.
And not so different from normal. But so then I think about pain, I think about affect as being able to draw a single line, like a single gradient, along which at any point in the line you can sort of expand and broaden out the line along other dimensions.
Yeah.
But as a single crucial line of sort of positive and negative valence, which generally correlates to something like a evolutionary approach avoid sort of mechanism. And everything that sort of falls on the avoid side of neutral as pain. So pain is this sort of broad spectrum avoid where the pain can be something like an emotional pain. It can be purely a psychological pain, say no particular emotional component, but something vague and something that impacts my state, my perception, and then of course something like a physical pain. And all of these sensations sum up to something like our understanding of pain, which essentially says avoid that thing, that concept, that person, that object, that space. And so maybe pain is just this broad catch-all for negative affective state. What do you think about that?
That's interesting, but I guess wouldn't that be a bit too if you're equating pain with anything that has a negative affective valence, then I guess the issue is, I mean, it's not just pain, right? There are also other kind of features that have negative affective valence, I would suppose, right? For example, like anxiety. Is that a kind of pain? Again, I'm not really sure, right? I would kind of intuitively say it's not, but it's not any reflective stance, right? Just intuitive, ordinary language use, I wouldn't say anxiety is a kind of pain. Yeah. Or there are also other kind of, I guess, phenomenological phenomenon that, it's a mouthful, something that we want to avoid in a way, but it's not necessarily pain. So I guess it's kind of hard to equate pain with that. And also, I guess, because there's so, I guess people talk about the different kind of apart from the affective aspect of pain, there are also other related aspects of pain, that it's kind of like it makes it a bit hard to just say that pain is only one thing as we think of it to be. It might be more beneficial to treat it as a group of things, including, bodily location, sensory discrimination, affective, motivational aspect of it, and also the relative kind of emotional and even cognitive aspect of it. And then it's very, very hard to draw a clear line between what is pain and what exactly is a response to pain, right? Lots of the times, it's kind of the line is very, very blurry. Again, it's difference in kind, right? Not really difference. Different in degree, not really difference in kind, right? So I guess that's the kind of idea. And then exactly. So I'm only beginning to get into this a little bit. So it's not like I have any substantial conclusion to draw from that. But it's just it's very interesting. I used to think of pain as something that's relatively simple. I mean, even when I kind of intellectually know that it certainly is not biologically very simple, but I think of it as a kind of a simple phenomenon. But then it turned out to be, not really.
What's the function of pain? What do you think?
I mean, to alert us to, I guess, bodily damages, primarily. I would suppose, yeah.
So if I ask you for a function, you can put a pain in one box, like the pain any kind serves this function, right? You don't want it to put it in a on the side of negative valence. But if I ask you for a function, you are able to put it.
But I guess the function is this. So when I think of function, I don't think of like any pain necessarily having the same function. That's not. I mean, that's kind of not the precise way of putting it. But I guess what I would say is that again, it's very much conjectural. But the idea is evolutionarily we are evolved with this capacity for pain, because pain generally, again, not necessarily, alerts us to bodily damage, for example, and then alerts us to, for example, attend to it or whatever. Mm-hmm. But it's not equating to saying that every pain must have this function to count as proper pain, right? So you can have what might be called psychogenic pain, for example. And
which kind of?
Psychogenic pain. So, the chronic pain or whatever that doesn't really point to any bodily issue or whatever. And then I wouldn't necessarily say that any pain must necessarily serve this function, otherwise it's not proper pain.
That's a pathology, right? Is that correct?
Apathology? What do you mean?
Apathology.
Yeah, pathology, yeah.
Yeah, so that's not something that it's on average population to have chronic pain.
Sure, yes.
So it's a pathology. But in general, pain fulfills a function of avoidancy.
Yeah.
So it make like we carry the possibility of receiving the signal of pain within our brain or any part of our body, because it fulfills a function for our ancestors, right? Yeah. Evolutionarily.
Yeah.
And then we can put it inside of a box of what pain is. Mm-hmm. Pain is this thing that fulfills this function.
Yeah, I mean,
and even though, anxiety doesn't seem to fulfill this function, I think it can fulfill this. I think it does. Cool. Sadness or ostracism or any kind of mental pain fulfills this function when you are a social animal.
Right. Alert you to something.
My group
existential threat.
Yeah,
existential threat.
Exactly.
So maybe the pain can be something like whether it's physical pain or something like emotional pain. What it's pointing to is that all emotional pain is built on the context of physical pain.
The emotional
the mechanism to experience emotional pain is built on the mechanism to experience physical pain. Right, and that it goes from something like detecting physical damage, which is you detect physical damage as an existential threat. So it's that's the only reason why detecting physical damage is important.
Yes.
So then any system that is then produces an existential threat, presumed existential threat, would use the same mechanism. That would potentially be my take.
That sounds cool. That sounds cool as a scientific hypothesis. I would say it's plausible. But I guess the issue with me, that kind of the concern with me, is more like one, that I'm, I guess like the function talk, I'm kind of always a bit alert to the philosophy use of functions, such that I'm afraid that it kind of becomes a sort of normative constraint. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So the concern would be like if you talk about pain having a proper function, and anything that doesn't fulfill that proper function becomes like there is this history of people talking about somebody having just imagined pain or not real pain or whatever, because they don't fulfill the kind of the general what we take to be the function of pain. I suppose that's kind of a concern, right? So that becomes a normative criterion. If it doesn't fulfill a function, it's not really pain. But I guess that's
what I was pointing to. It's an evolutionary argument. Obviously, there will be situations on what has been evolved will not fulfill the function. Obviously, we have appendices, and that's just the case. But you look at the evolutionary past, and then you make an assumption that, that's where is it coming from?
Yeah, again, I totally agree, right? That's kind of one aspect of analysis of pain. But then I guess the relation between that and what we nowadays, right now, want to identify as pain, there is still kind of a gap, right?
Yeah, you knew what appendices were good for before, and then now you don't have like a constraint of like, okay, what is this thing doing here now? It's just like that's not fulfilling any function there. It's just a leftover from evolution, even though it doesn't fulfill the function. You don't have any problem of trying to figure out, well, here maybe it might be that or might be this, or...
No, the problem here is exclusion, right? And invalidation of somebody's experience. So the point, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, is if somebody's experiencing pain, that doesn't necessarily correlate to something which we might say has a functional purpose. We can still say that their ability to experience the pain meets the evolutionary criteria, but their current experience of pain, if it's pathological, might not fit that criteria. Therefore, we ought to still call it pain.
Yeah, but if it's pathological, it's pathological.
Right, but it's still pain. And so if you only define...
But like, because it's pathological, you don't undefine it.
Right, but if you only define pain evolutionarily in terms of function, then you exclude that. So the point in the conversation, I think maybe what you're pushing back on, if I'm getting correctly, it's correct to push back on the evolution-only explanation of the concept of pain, because then it naturally excludes this.
If it is pathological, so you account for different factors,
right?
Which is the pathology. So you don't have to exclude evolution. You just have to account for different factors that makes that pain exist on that context.
So it's a necessary, non-sufficient condition of the concept. You're saying that the fact that it serves an evolutionary function, the fact that you can experience pain, is a necessary but not sufficient condition, not entirely sufficient condition for pain, because then individuals who are experiencing pain without a direct function.
And serves for anything that can be explained evolutionarily. Like there are mutations.
Yep.
Things happen.
For different factors. The mechanism is evolutionary, but the given case is not necessarily something where you could determine fitness by.
Exactly.
Yeah. So of course, like nobody denies that evolutionary explanation do give us lots of knowledge about what pain really are and what they're supposed to do. But I guess the more complex issue is the identification of pain, given the variance of features that could be associated with it, becomes a bit more of a complex issue. And oftentimes you have to make a bit of decision. What exactly counts as pain, what the term pain, what the concept of pain should be used to apply to. But anyway,
Okay, one more thought. If you're trying to define pain, if we agree that pain is not everything, because I agree with your rebuttal, that not everything on the sort of negatively valent side of affect, it's not all encompassing, but that maybe all pain does fall on negative valent side of affect.
I see.
Does that make sense? And then the reason why I kind of start there, if we potentially agree on that, is then if you define all the concepts which then might be used to create a sum total of negative affect, would pain be something like all of those experiences which have distinct dimensions that you can measure from other things? So say, like, if I look at anxiety and pain, one thing that you mentioned that I think both anxiety and pain share one dimension is sort of that psychological component of I don't want to experience this anymore. So they share that one dimension. But then where they differ along a different dimension is sort of this physical experience. Anxiety, you can physically experience something. But the paininess of pain, right, is something that you don't necessarily
the more sensory
experience.
discriminatory sort of element of that.
Exactly. Whereas you might have something like something like an accelerated heart rate, nervousness in general is unpleasant. Maybe that's one way to think about it. Does that make sense to you?
So what you're saying is that pain, first of all, pain is necessarily negatively valenced.
Right.
And second of all, then you have to introduce some other sort of criterion, like the sensory discriminatory criterion too.
Right. And then, maybe you define pain as everything it's not within a certain bounds, and those bounds is the negative side of affect. You define it
probably, but I'm kind of still. I find it a bit. I'm not really sure what to say about the necessarily negative kind of valence side of pain, because one, you have the typical example of like dissociation. You have some sort of pain experience without it being negatively valenced, so that's certainly possible. You have pain asymbolia, and then there are some cases where you administer morphine, and they would have that kind of effect. I think. If my memory was right.
So
and
maybe... sorry.
No, go ahead.
So what I was going to say, maybe the psychological component, because many people can find pain pleasurable.
Yeah, exactly.
So there's a psychological component where that isn't necessarily negatively valent. So you have some dimension along which it's not negatively valent.
Yes.
But then that physical experience again, I'm just sort of off the top of my head here, but maybe there's some dimension along which is always negative, and then some dimension where you can relax a negativity constraint, where you have something like a positive. So if you think about a conceptual space and you have an x and y axis, maybe along the x-axis it's always negative, but along the y-axis you have negative and positive.
That's interesting.
And so that's something like pain.
I mean, it sounds like a possible maneuver, but how substantial that would come to be, right? So that kind of appears to be able to explain everything, but I guess the issue is like how, I don't know. It sounds too powerful. It's just anything. It's just automatically explained, right?
True.
So I'm not sure.
It's more for fun, but that's
fun.
That's a good point.
Yeah, I think some kinds of pain that might be associated with pleasure. I always think about what they come with, right? Because then there is this thing, right? The tattoos, like there is the end goal of getting the tattoo done, the design, and the pleasure that I will have on having it done. I idealized that I wanted to have it. It is still painful. It will be painful, but maybe it doesn't bother me. I'm happier with the outcome of it. Or when, or with some sex activity and there is some pain, something, there might be another thing there for you, right? The control or the environment or being with that person specifically or something like this. So it's not about the pain itself. Like there's something else going on that like drives, like the pain might be still there, and then you get a different affect out of it.
But I guess I'm still a bit more skeptical about that, especially in the kind of the masochist side of things. I guess with tattoo, I guess I'm more or less with you. But in terms of the masochist sort of side of things, I'm a bit more skeptical. I'm kind of like, well, I guess for masochists, the pain sensation and the sort of it's very closely tied to the pleasurable aspect of it, such that, I mean, you may artificially separate them. You may kind of construct a framework which says, well, pain is always necessarily bad, but then you have some kind of later correction of that negative valence almost. But I'm not sure I'm not sure how substantial that is, right? So you kind of always separate. You can, I mean, obviously you can always maintain that pain is always bad, right? As long as you make enough adjustments elsewhere. But I guess the thing is that to what extent is that phenomenologically plausible, and to what extent is that psychologically plausible? I don't know. It's
good point. I mean, that it's really fun to think about. I really dig that you're doing the work on pain.
So I mean, just one very quick final thought, right? Philosophers never talk about these kind of cases. So when they talk about pain, they say, well, pain is always necessarily bad. They never really talk about the case of, a masochist, the possibility of a masochist enjoying pain very much as itself. I think it's just a very funny sociological phenomenon.
Yeah, that is really funny. Not enough people talk about sex as though it's an existent phenomenon. So maybe if we move more to, since we're sort of slowly running out of time, is there a sort of like a broader motivation behind your work, or is there something that you'd ideally be working on? Is this it? Like, is it that your concepts are sort of the main thing that's driving you into philosophy? Are you really interested in philosophical contributions more broadly?
I mean, again, once again, my philosophical interest is very, very broad. And I guess the good thing about doing in this kind of topic, doing a PhD in this kind of topic, is that it's this whole conceptual engineering thing is broad enough, as the kind of the topics that we have covered here shows, that this is broad enough for me to do a bunch of things that I'm interested in without worrying about not without, but kind of it reduces the worry of being just very scattered and not very coherent, right? Because this is the coherent theme that drives my investigations into very different realms, into ethics, into political philosophy, into even philosophy of medicine and stuff, and philosophy of cognitive science, whatever. But then it kind of ties all these kind of things together with the theme of conceptual engineering, conceptual negotiation, which I really appreciate, because it gives me the freedom and space to explore a lot of things.
That's so fun. I'm definitely a bit envious. That's so fun. You're like you're redefining the concept of scattered and making it positively valence. You're like, this is exactly this is exactly the point, because I'm unifying it with a single framework. No, I love that.
Yeah. Is there anything in life that you would like to get done? Would make you happy if it happens?
that's
scientifically or personally. If you want to say something personally or not as well. Anything
I don't know. I'm just. Nowadays I'm trying to finish off a short story. I'm just kind of stuck.
No, short story.
I hope I'm finishing that before the end of July. But yeah, that's kind of what I'm hoping for.
Cool.
Right on.
Yeah. Okay.
No, it's not. I mean, it's not random. I'm a poet.
Right. Yeah.
He's an artist. He's a musician. So.
Nice. Great.
Yeah. Cool. I guess we'll wrap up there then.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Bojin.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.